SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 5. Hermione. It was one of the bleakest, quietest nights I had ever spent. I noted that I didn't feel tired or hungry or dirty, and though I'd found a moderately comfortable place to sit between the smooth, cool roots of the tree, I wasn't inclined to sleep. Apparently Draco wasn't either. He sat where he had been, by the clock, gazing straight ahead, eyes unfocused. His tears finally dried, but as I watched him, I found myself wishing he would cry more. His stark, pale face without tears unsettled me. I also had no inclination to leave the shelter of this willow. At all. Ever. Deep inside me, a reasonable little voice told me that that was madness, but right at the moment, I liked the quiet. I liked the fact that my surroundings weren't changing as fast as flipping pages of a picture book. It was a relief, this monotony, this sameness, and if it so much as one tiny spider crawled across the back of my hand, I would lose my mind. I was still fighting to digest what I had seen. It sat like a cold rock in my stomach, like faint nausea at the onset of being ill. I watched him as he sat there, watched the slight rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed, watched his long lashes as he blinked slowly. I bit my lip. I said nothing. The moment I first met Draco Malfoy, I had his character pegged. He was a selfish, egotistical, stubborn, arrogant, spoiled only child with a superiority complex, coupled with a chip on his shoulder. Then the day he first called me a mudblood, I began to hate him. With every encounter, my opinion of him shrank until he was a cockroach in my eyes, cowardly, shallow, and worthless. I never had wondered if he was lonesome. I had never wondered what it would be like to know that my mother was slightly afraid of my father. I had never considered how it would be to worship my father, yet be haunted by doubting his love. I had never asked myself if I could bear living in coldness and darkness and stone, the shadows of Death Eaters often flitting across the walls of my home, with the Dark Lord a frequent subject of discussion around the dinner table. Yet I had looked at reality in the eye at least once a week since I was 11, and those thoughts had never entered my mind. Until tonight. I wrapped my arms around my chest and leaned my head sideways against a root, glancing at Draco for the 100th time, and then my gaze lingered, and a strange idea crossed the edges of my thoughts. What if I had been the child of Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy? Would I have turned out any different? I went quiet and still, and my mind cradled that thought like a sharp, fragile piece of glass. I tried to grit my teeth. Of course I would be different. I was stronger, better, braver. I remembered Draco's face as he had gazed up at his father. Draco, whose hands and chest had been covered in blood from a wound his father had inflicted, and yet the look in Draco's blue eyes had been one of shame, guilt, and love. I twisted where I sat, forcing my thoughts down another, more rational road. Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy had been an illusion when I had seen them, but perhaps the subjects of their speech were not so imaginary. After all, the Room of Requirement had to get its material from somewhere. What had they meant by a Horcrux? The words had sounded familiar, as if I had read it or heard it a very long time ago, but I couldn't place its meaning. I was, however, certain that it was not good. If it was a subject of contention between the Malfoys, and perhaps one that carried danger, and if it was spoken of in the same breath as the prophecy, I supposed they meant, then it had something to do with Voldemort. I took a long, slow breath, and again gazed sideways at Draco's profile, and the way the light shone off his hair, of his crown, of his head. What task had they meant? What was he supposed to do that was so important that they would all be killed if he didn't? Is that why he had been crying in the bathroom? Draco moved. I twitched. He lay down on his side, his back to me, and pillowed his golden head on his arm, but I could tell by his breathing that he wasn't asleep. And so I sat there in the silence, listening to the very faint rush of the wind outside as it wandered through the stalks of barley, until the night grew deep and thick, and I wished with all my might for a gleam of light to cut through the darkness. I opened my eyes. I frowned. I didn't remember falling asleep, or even being drowsy. I lifted my head from the root and glanced around. My heart thudded. Draco was gone. I stood up and searched the corners of the willow room. Wind rustled, and through the draping branches I caught a glimpse of gold. I crossed the soft grass, pushed the long leaves out of the way, and squinted, then blinking hard. Bright morning sunlight washed over me, warming me up, almost blinding me. Hot, laughing wind greeted me, blowing through my hair, and I took a deep breath. Finally, I could open my eyes and gaze over the waving fields of gold. I'd never been so grateful to see the morning. I stepped out, trailing my hands over the tops of the stalks, letting them run through my fingers. They whispered in response and chattered back at the wind that disturbed their ranks. I lifted my head and scanned the reaches of the field. There. Draco walked head down, his shirt untucked, his hands in his pockets. Wind mussed his hair as he followed the edges of the barley field, several meters away from the line where the forest bordered the field. I stopped and let out a short sigh. He didn't see me, even as he walked past me a distance. Either that or he was ignoring me. I followed him with my eyes as he trailed all the way around the large field, as if he was measuring the distance. It took a long time because the field was large, and his steps were steady and slow. But for some reason, it wasn't tedious to watch his progress, almost as if it took no time at all. Then, when he came back around, he sat down a good distance in front of the opening of the forest path, so that I could only see the top of his head. I stood there for several more minutes. He lay down on his back and disappeared from view, so I sat down where I was. The barley rasped and rattled all around me now, shielding me from the wind. I listened to its rhythm, watched the way the sunlight gleamed across the top of the stalks. I closed my eyes and felt the sun on my face. The things I'd been thinking of during the night waited inside my consciousness, and I turned them over inside me as I would slowly turn a smooth stone over and over in my hands. All my muscles relaxed. My mind wandered. I opened my eyes. I frowned faintly. All at once, I got the distinct impression that I'd been sitting there for hours and hours. Either that, or I had just sat down a few seconds ago. My frown deepened. There was a new puzzle for me to chew on. I lay down on my back and stared up at the cloudless blue sky. To me, it looked like a late August sky, very high and blue, and warm. I shifted. I couldn't find a comfortable place for my head. I tried to put my hands behind my head, but that just made the grass poke the skin of my hands. I need a pillow, I muttered to myself. Then I realized what I just thought, and glanced around. According to the rules I knew, the room of requirement should produce a pillow if I had a thought like that. But there was no pillow. I growled in my throat and let my head thud back into the ground. I made a face. This position was getting more and more itchy and uncomfortable. How could Malfoy have been lying down for so long in this? I wonder if he needs a pillow. A black pillow dropped onto my stomach. I yelped and sat up and grabbed it. My fingers sank down into the soft material, and I stared at the faded Slytherin crest right in the middle. I studied it, running my hands across it, frowning hard. Interesting. This was a key to the new rules in this room. I knew it was. I just needed to think about it more. I got up. I couldn't see Draco, but I knew he had not moved. I traipsed forwards, hearing the barley right itself from my smashing it down. At last I caught a glimpse of his white shirt and pale face. His eyes were closed, and both hands cradled his head. His brow furrowed. He looked uncomfortable. "Here," I said. His eyes flew open and found me. Then they fixed on the pillow I held out to him. He sat up, then gave me a wary look. "Where did you get that?" "It landed on me while I was lying down," I answered. "It's mine," he snapped. "Give it to me." "I was going to," I said as he snatched it out of my hands. He shoved it behind his head, then lay back down and closed his eyes. I looked at him incredulously. "Aren't you even mildly curious as to why it landed on top of me and not you?" He didn't say anything. I bit the back of my cheek and sat down a few feet from him, but the barley shielded him. I frowned ahead of me, trying to process. I was thinking to myself how intensely uncomfortable I was lying in the itchy grass, and I decided I needed a pillow. I began, but nothing happened. Not like it ought to have. Then I remembered that you were lying out here as well, and wondered if you were having the same trouble. Then a Slytherin pillow just landed on my stomach. It dropped out of nowhere, like it should have the first time I wished for one. But it was obviously meant for you. It's your pillow. Nothing happened when I thought of myself. It only worked when I thought of you. "Why are you talking?" Malfoy's voice came over the rustling of the grass. I frowned in his direction. "I thought you might be interested." "Listen, just because I apologized doesn't mean we're friends, Granger," he muttered. I waited for that remark to sting. His words always did. But this time, nothing happened. The words fell into the air. I heard them, and understood, and there was a quiet in my heart. So I just smirked. "Don't flatter yourself, Malfoy. It's just a pillow." He did not reply, but he didn't tell me to go away either. So I kept thinking out loud. The room isn't acting the way it should, I decided. At least, it isn't acting the way we're accustomed to it acting. Usually, a person is walking along and thinking of something he or she really needs, and the room supplies it. But is there a difference between need and want? And why on earth would it think we need to be scared out of our wits every time we try to leave? I paused. Now that I think about it, I mused, you were probably right. I think we did confuse it a little. A little? Malfoy scoffed. There are goblins in here, and snakes as long as I am. So far, that blasted pillow is the only thing it's gotten right. But that forest and all the stupid... Wait. I blinked. He hesitated and then let out a rough laugh. What? This place has made you barking mad. My eyebrows went up. Why? You just said I was right, he snorted. Or maybe you're not the real Granger after all. It would only make sense. Having a nonsensical conversation about pillows with a Muggleborn is just the sort of nightmarish thing this room would throw at me. He was trying to be insulting. Instead, I felt a slow smile spread over my face. He hadn't called me a mudblood. Stranger things have happened, I managed, stifling my grin. Then I made myself focus back down, letting my words flow with my thoughts. You also reminded me that magic has rules. This room has rules, even if we flabbergasted it a bit. The Room of Requirement uses a mind-reading enchantment. It produces what you most need. Therefore, it has access to a person's thoughts and is able to create exactly what that person imagines, or even better. From what I've seen, it believes that this barley field is real, and the forest is real, and beyond that lies the door. I paused, thinking. But I believe that the path is an illusion, as is everything that we see when we leave the path. What makes you think that about the path? Draco questioned. I hesitated. Well, earlier, I saw you. You were knocking on a tree like it was a door, and calling out to people. What people? He growled. I winced, glad he couldn't see me. Oh, a few members of Ravenclaw, I bluffed. I wondered what you were doing until I realized you must have been inside another illusion that I couldn't see. He went quiet again. I shifted, trying to regather my thoughts. I'm not sure about the willow, though. The light doesn't look right in there, but I definitely prefer it to the forest. I thought a moment longer. And I suppose it is possible for some illusions to invade this space if we fell asleep, for example. I cocked my head. But that's another thing. I trailed off, pondering for a long moment. That's another thing what? Prompted Draco. I jumped. I hadn't realized he was listening. Well, I began, disconcerted at the ideas forming in my mind. Time seems strange here, as if a great deal of it is passing, or none at all, as if we're in a dream. I notice that I don't feel tired or hungry, even though it feels like we've been here an entire day and night. My voice lowered, and I almost spoke to myself. Is it possible that we're only halfway conscious? That this is all a dream? Rubbish, Draco snorted. It can't work like that. Then this enchantment is beyond me, because it makes no sense otherwise, I said, irritated. Ah, another impossible confession, Draco said harshly. I think you are a phantom, Granger. If the wind blew harder, you'd probably disappear. Don't be stupid, I shot back. I shifted. As much as I would like to disappear. But in order to do that, we have to figure out how the room became confused in the first place, exactly, and what it tried to construct for us. Then we have to go back into that forest, and there is no we, Granger, Draco snapped, stopping me short. I am not going back into that forest. Ever. I'll starve to death here first. His voice lowered, but gained resolve. And nothing you can say will make me change my mind. I sat there as the wind shook the barley. I swallowed hard, and my brow tightened. Slowly, I got up and dusted off my skirt and knees. I looked at him. He stared at the sky like he was seeing something else, his eyes stark, his mouth hard. I don't blame you, I murmured, and without waiting for him to say anything back, I turned and walked away, setting out to measure the perimeter myself. Much as it had earlier in the morning, time passed without my feeling it, and yet it felt like forever. I bit my lip as I circled the barley field for the third time. This was like a dream, the most realistic, vivid, fantastic dream I had ever had. The smell of the earth and wind, baked grass, filled my lungs. The feel of the barley between my fingers fascinated me, and the sound of the wind and my steady, crunching footsteps surrounded my hearing. The sun slowly went down, turning gold, then orange, then red, and purple twilight followed in its wake. I watched Draco get up and trail slowly back toward the lonesome tree, taking his pillow with him. I traipsed a little farther, then sighed as darkness fell and the wind grew chilly. I turned and followed him. When I parted the long willow curtain with both hands, I caught sight of him sitting by that motionless clock again. He didn't look at me. He didn't say anything. I hesitated, then entered as well, watching the little golden lights flit upwards from the grass at my feet. I sat down by the root I'd found earlier, and leaned back against the great tree. I stayed there for an interminable amount of time, measuring my breathing. Finally, Draco lay down on the grass on his side, his back to me. I rested my head against the bark. I could hear the wind moving through the grasses outside, but in here it was very quiet. I watched Draco breathing his rise and fall. Soon it became deep and even, and I realized with surprise that he had fallen asleep this time. Somehow, after the thought had sunk in, that fact relieved me. My shoulders relaxed, and I let out a long sigh. I let my eyelids flutter closed. Malfoy jerked and let out a cry. I sat up, my eyes flying open. Draco had fallen onto his back, and though his eyes were closed, his expression had gone tight, troubled, and he lifted his hand. Then, as I watched him, the tension in his brow loosened, and his hand rested against his chest. I sat still for another minute, making sure he was really asleep, then lay back down again. I closed my eyes. Slumber pulled at the edges of my consciousness. Draco thrashed. I almost jumped to my feet. He took fistfuls of grass and tore them up, then started breathing hard. I gritted my teeth, sat back down against the tree, and glared upward. Perfect. Another piece of enchantment. I couldn't rest without him having nightmares. I sank back down, rubbing my face, and glanced over at him. His muscles still looked tight, his breathing unsteady, his hands closed in fists. I sighed. Fine. He needed sleep more than I did. After considering for a second, I took a breath and began to sing quietly. I felt slightly stupid as I did, but I was willing to try. Besides, it would break the unbearable quiet. Over in Killarney, many years ago, my mother sang a song to me in tones so sweet and low. Just a simple little ditty in her good old Irish way. But I'd give the world if she could sing that song to me this day. I paused. Something shimmered around the edges of Draco's body where he lay on the grass. Warm, golden light. One of his hands relaxed, and his shoulders, but for his forehead, looked tight. I swallowed and went on to the chorus, and as I did, the shimmers drifted up and rested upon him like fireflies. Toora-loora-loora, toora-loora-lie, toora-loora-loora, hush now, don't you cry. Toora-loora-loora, toora-loora-lie, toora-loora-loora, that's an Irish lullaby. With each note I sang, the shimmers lighted on his forehead, and his chest and his arms, and set him glowing. Draco's body loosened notch by notch, until by the time I'd reached the last phrase, his face had smoothed, and the shimmers had sank down inside him and vanished. But he was asleep, quite asleep. My lips parted as I fell silent, and I just stared at him, transfixed. Incredible. Slowly I sat back and let my eyes close, forcing myself to stop thinking about the lullaby and the golden lights. I finally succeeded in relaxing and falling asleep. Draco. I slept. I must have, because when I'd closed my eyes it was dark, and when I opened them I could see the sun shining through the willow curtain. I sat up and ran my hand through my hair. I remembered something. I remembered dozing off, then being bothered by some sort of deep, frightening feeling. It hadn't been a nightmare because there hadn't been any images, but it had held me there, tightening down, locking my muscles up. And then a voice had cut in, singing. I hadn't been able to understand the words, but as soon as it began, warmth had crept over me and into my chest, and I completely relaxed. I had seen a soft gold glow for a second, and then I don't remember any more after that. I frowned and glanced around the willow room. Where was Granger? A dart of worry tightened my gut. She hadn't abandoned me to find the door again, had she? I swore under my breath and got up, leaving my pillow there, then parted the willow curtain with a shove from both hands and swept out into the morning. I stopped, blinded by sunlight. I held up a hand to shield my eyes, and then rubbed my face and squinted out across the field. My eyebrows went up. How was it possible that this grass could literally look as if it were made of swaying, bending gold? Different movement caught my eye. I turned and saw Granger striding around the perimeter, a safe distance away from the forest fence. She walked with her head down and did not see me as she walked past the place where I had lain yesterday, or whenever that had been. My frown darkened. It killed me to admit it, even just to myself, but she might be right. We might be in a semi-dream. How else could I not feel even remotely hungry, or stiff, or grungy, or tired? How long had we actually been here anyway? I kicked that thought away even as I kicked at the barley, rammed my hands into my pockets, and trailed away from the willow. I didn't know where I was going. Where was there to go? Not down the path, never again. So I had to walk to the perimeter, and to avoid running into Granger, I had to follow her, from a great distance, of course. I did that for several hours, or 10 minutes, or both. I finally decided that if I didn't stop trying to figure out the blasted time thing, it was going to drive me insane. I kept kicking the barley and trailing after that girl, careful to maintain the same distance between us. Then Granger stopped. I looked at her, and stopped as well. She was perhaps 100 meters ahead of me. I had no idea how many times we had circled the field by now. Maybe 5? Granger stared up at the sky for a moment, then sat down and flopped onto her back. She disappeared. My chest jolted. I knew she had just lain down, and the barley hid her. I knew she was still there, and hadn't fallen through the door. I knew I wasn't alone in this horrible place. I broke into a run. "What are you doing? Stop it, you ninny," a scornful voice said in the back of my head. And my steps hitched, but I still couldn't see her. I swallowed hard, then slowed to a trot, searching ahead of me. There. I saw her. Her school uniform was black, so I could see patches of it between the stalks. I slowed, then stopped. I shoved my hands into my pockets again, feeling like a fool. Wind tossed my hair and rattled the grain, like it was laughing at me. "You woke up," Granger observed. I ground my teeth and didn't answer, waiting for her next remark. It didn't come. I shifted my weight and glanced into the forest. She had been facing it when she lay down, and now her feet pointed in that direction. I narrowed my eyes at her. "You're planning something." "Yes, but nothing drastic," she answered. I snorted and rolled my eyes. "Right. Since when have you done anything that wasn't drastic?" "You don't know anything about me," she replied coolly. I glared in her direction, though I still couldn't see her. "I've been around Hogwarts long enough to know that you and Weasley and Potter are always the ones getting into trouble doing stupid and dangerous things," I countered. "Saving the school and everyone in it isn't what I'd call a tea party, Malfoy," she said, her voice hard now. I blinked. I didn't know what to make of that. Instead, I stepped closer to her so I could see her face. Her long-lashed eyes were closed, her expression clear, like she was asleep, but her mouth was set. It irritated me. I cocked an eyebrow. "What are you planning, Granger?" "It doesn't involve you," she answered. "Good," I said, folding my arms, "because you should know that my saving you from the snakes was a temporary lapse in sanity on my part, and I won't be repeating it." "Fine," she said lightly. I stared at her. She did not open her eyes, but she raised her eyebrows. "Why don't you go find something to do?" "What?" I yelped. Then my mouth worked for a moment as my mind scrambled. "Did you just dismiss me?" "No," she answered, still infuriatingly calm. "I'm suggesting that you go do something besides breaking my concentration." I threw my hands out to the sides to encompass the empty field. "And what would you suggest?" I cried. "Knitting?" "Go read." I gaped. "Read?" "Yes." I swore at her, in German. I wasn't a complete idiot. I knew what her fist felt like. I also knew it felt infinitely good to let loose a stream of profanity that she did not understand. Then I kicked the nearby stalks hard, swung around, and stormed back to the willow. I told myself that she was just insufferable. I told myself I was angry at her impertinence and rudeness. I did not entertain the thought that I was still afraid of that forest, and the sameness of this place was driving me mad. I slapped through the willow curtain, stomped into the green grass, and jerked to a halt. There, by the silent grandfather clock and my pillow, sat a stack of 4 books. I stared at them. Go read. How had she done that? Warily, I edged toward the books, then bent down to peer at the titles. I did not recognize them. "The Complete Sherlock Holmes," I murmured. "Black Beauty, Pride and Prejudice. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus." I picked up the last one and studied it. It was infinitely smaller than the other 3. Were these Muggle books? If so, why was there one about Santa Claus? I glanced at the willow curtain, nervous that Granger would burst in and laugh at me, hunched over these ridiculous manuscripts. But all I heard was the rustle of barley and the toss of the wind. I sat down and opened the cover of the Santa Claus book. "Dear Editor, I am 8 years old. Some of my little friends say there is no Santa Claus. I stood up so fast that I almost lost my balance. Incredulity flooded me. My eyes flew over the words until I had finished the whole book. Hermione. What's all this nonsense about people not believing in Santa Claus? Draco's gruff voice came from behind me, and then something thudded onto the ground by my hand. I opened my eyes and glanced to my left to see a little copy of the book, Yes, Virginia, There is a Santa Claus, lying on the ground. My brow furrowed and I sat up, then took the book in both hands. Amazing! Earlier, I'd lain as still as I could, asking the room to give Draco a few books to read to distract him. I had no idea it would supply some of my favorite books for him. I tried to open the cover. I couldn't. Interesting. Only he could read it. I glanced up at Draco, who stood a few paces away, his arms folded, his jaw set. He clearly expected an answer. Well, it's a legitimate question, isn't it? I asked. One that almost every child asks until he discovers the truth. I shrugged. I don't believe in Santa Claus. Draco looked at me like I had turned purple. What? He said. I don't believe in Santa Claus, I repeated. Draco still stared, as if I was speaking Chinese. I mean, I love this book, I half smiled and held it up, and I think it's a delightful idea, but I can't believe that a merry old immortal lives on the North Pole and flies around in a sleigh pulled by reindeer, delivering toys to millions of children by way of sliding down their chimneys. I laughed. It's absurd. Draco gave me a look now that was downright ugly. I hope you realize how stupid you sound. I blinked, losing all my humor. What? He shook his head. Muggles, he scoffed, then shook his head again and gazed condescendingly out over the field. I've said it a lot of times. So has my father. If we wizards were to waltz down the middle of the busiest street in London, nobody would give us a second glance. What's the point of keeping magic a secret? He bent towards me, his eyes in taints. Muggles wouldn't believe it if they saw it with their own eyes, because they are all completely daft. Anger rose inside me. Listen, I said. Just because Muggles don't believe in magic doesn't mean Santa Claus is real, he stated. I've seen him. I stopped. You what? I've seen him, he said again. Talked to him, in fact. I gawked at him. How on earth? I was 12, Malfoy went on. Home for Christmas holiday. I was up late trying to get a peek of my presents before I was supposed to. But when I went into the sitting room, there was the tree. He was standing there like he was waiting for him. Looked right at me. I held my breath. Draco's gaze had drifted off, and I could tell he was remembering. There wasn't a hint of deception on him. He looked just about like any other wizard. Old wizard, that is. More like Professor Dumbledore. Draco hesitated. He swallowed, but he did not look at me. He wore red and gold, with spectacles and a belt with bells, and polished boots. He had soot on his shoulder. He made me sit down in my father's armchair. He looked at me a long time, and then he talked to me. Or more like he gave me a scolding. My mouth fell open. He scolded you? Draco prodded something with his foot. It was nothing. He made me give back a present that I'd swiped from Blaze. He shrugged. I didn't think it was all that important, but Claus was firm about it. He said he was very forgiving, but that he wouldn't tolerate someone else's presents being stolen, and if I did that again, all I would get was sneezing powder the next year. Draco smirked, and for an instant he met my eyes. So, I never did that again. My mind was spinning. I tried to make my voice work. You mean you actually spoke with... Malfoy gave me another one of those superior kickbacks of his head, and I was so familiar, his expression hardening again. Use that muggle-poisoned brain of yours for once, Granger, Malfoy growled. I can make a snake jump out of my wand. You can make a feather float without touching it. McGonagall can flip a time-turner in the afternoon and pick up the mail she forgot to get in the morning. He shook his head once and gave me a look that was so much resembled his father. A flying sleigh and coming down chimneys is second-year stuff. Listen, Malfoy. I threw the book down and got to my feet. Some things, like flying sleighs and men hopping down chimneys, are commonplace to you, and so it's easy for you to believe in them. In fact, you don't even have to believe, because they're just, like... I gestured wildly, trying to get my brain to work through my fury. They're like homework and taxes and death. You see them everywhere right in front of you. They're reality. I looked right at him, trying to get it into his thick skull. But Muggles don't see floating feathers and time-turners. They have to accept everything like that on faith alone, no proof at all. I stepped toward him and giving him a severe look. And it doesn't make them stupid if they don't believe in magic. It makes them cynical and tired and maybe a little bitter. But without a snatch of magic at all, Muggles have sailed across oceans, built flying machines, written symphonies, and walked on the moon. I shook my head, letting my hands fall to my sides. But you've never tried to understand that side of the world. You just like condemning people and thinking that you're better than they are. Well, you're not. I lifted my chin. Try living one day out there completely without magic, without a single protection charm or invisibility cloak or healing potion. To most wizards, that would be a terrifying prospect. I lowered my voice. But Muggles live it every day of their lives, and they still have homes and families and jobs and happiness. And they fight wars and criminals and disease and death completely without magic. I took a deep breath. Muggles aren't stupid. In fact, they're far braver than most wizards I've ever known. Draco looked back at me as if he'd never seen me before. He took a breath, then broke eye contact, gazing into the forest. What are you planning, Granger? I started. Had he been able to read my fear through that tirade? I gritted my teeth. I'm going to stay the night out in the field. I felt him regard me, but I turned and sat back down, facing the forest path again. And what are you hoping to gain by that little exercise? He asked, an edge to his voice. Whatever I can, I answered, narrowing my eyes into the darkness. I'm going to do something you never have. I smiled crookedly, getting a bit of my own back. But it's something all great Muggles explorers and inventors have done. I heard the blackness in his voice. Really? And what's that? I took a breath. I'm going to give it a shot and see what happens. I expected him to say something nasty. I had provoked him enough. But he just watched me for a bit, then turned and walked away. I listened to his footsteps as he went. I tried to keep my mouth shut and concentrate on the task at hand. Honestly, I did, but then it just leaped out at me, breaking all my restraint. Malfoy! I called, halfway twisting to see him. He stopped and frowned back at me. Okay, I had his attention. Might as well finish the stupid question. Did you really? I tried, but I couldn't finish. He lifted an eyebrow, patronizing me as ever. Yes, Granger, he said, there is a Santa Claus. I blushed, feeling like an idiot. He gave me that cold look a moment longer, then turned back. But did I almost see him smile? I faced front again, hiding a grin. And somehow, it made me feel a little braver as I sat there, waiting for night to come.